Okay. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm pleased to welcome everyone on the International Roundtable on Organized Crime and Criminal Traditions. And we are about to start the round panel dedicated to current tendencies in criminalization on the national and transnational levels. I'm Konstantin Slobodanyuk, and of course it's honor to me to be your moderator on this discussion panel. And let me please introduce our speakers in the order they are given the floor to speak. So, Oleg Maltsev is an author, criminologist, psychologist, photographer, investigative journalist, academician of Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, founder of Criminalistics Institute and Expeditionary Corps. He is an author of numerous books in the areas such as applied history, sociology, depth psychology, philosophy, criminalistics, and criminology. Jerome Crace is an emeritus professor, sociologist, Murray Koppelman Professor, School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Also, Jerome Crace is an expert in sociology, gentrification in Brooklyn, Brooklyn ethnic groups, Italian-American politics, culture, race, class, urban life, and ethnicity in New York. He is a public activist scholar and serves as a consultant to public and private agencies regarding urban community issues. Emilio Viana. Emilio Viana is a president of the International Society for Criminology, president at Bellagio Forum for World Security and Social Development. He is on the Harvard University list of national security professors, editor-in-chief of the International Annals of Criminology, Cambridge University Press, a member of the board of directors of the International Association of Penal Law and of the International Society for Social Defense. Jeffrey Danick. Jeffrey is a consultant and investigator, former FBI leader with diverse 28-year career and significant experience across all FBI program lines. Danick has extensive experience with the FBI undercover program. His assignments included as a supervisor and action watch commander of the FBI's counterterrorism division. He holds the unique distinction of serving as an acting assistant agent in charge of both a violent crime and a white-collar crime branch of the major FBI field office. Eduardo Almeida is a CEO at Indra and Minced Brazil. He manages more than 8,000 specialists and has more than 25 years of professional experience in companies such as Alcatel, Cisco Systems, and Unisys. Previously, he served as vice president and general manager for Unisys Corporation in Latin America. One of his main professional interests are cybercrime. And Salvatore Amato. Salvatore Amato is a recognized expert with 30 years in the fields of wildlife law enforcement, including more than a decade as a senior manager with the US Fish and Wildlife Service. He served as a senior advisor to the Interpol Environmental Security Program and Interpol liaison to the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. So let me please deliver a few words about the format of this roundtable. So each speaker holds the opportunity to answer 2 questions formulated and presented to speakers in advance. So please limit the extent of answers up to 10 minutes. 10 minutes. To begin with, we shall start the discussion on the first subject. Afterwards, each expert will have the opportunity to express his views on the second topic. And let me say several words about such minor but important aspects such as breaks. You may grab a glass of water or use the washroom anytime you need. Just to make sure that your mic is off. So, the first question of the round table is, what are the current tendencies in criminalization of the national and transnational levels? And I give the floor to Professor Oleg Maltsev, please.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues.
Я вас всех рад видеть.
I'm happy to greet you all.
Для меня большая честь открывать наш круглый стол.
It's an honor for me to open this round table.
И я хотел бы представить вашему вниманию мой небольшой доклад, касающийся первого вопроса.
And I would like to present my small report which regards the first question of this round table.
Когда стоит вопрос о том, что будет с преступностью как бы дальше,
when the question is about what is going to be the state of affairs with organized crime from now on,
я бы хотел как бы обратить ваше внимание прежде всего, что на территории земного шара были разные страны, и в них была всегда разная обстановка.
we should look at the situation globally and understand that in all countries around the globe, they all had certain set of circumstances. I mean, every country is always different.
И определенные страны как бы считали себя цивилизованными.
And certain countries considered themselves to be civilized.
А вот то государство, где живу я, Украину, международное вот это вот сообщество всегда считало не совсем цивилизованной как бы страной.
But for instance, in the country that I live, Ukraine, the international community always thought it to be uncivilized country.
То есть это, в общем-то, с точки зрения международного сообщества, некое преступное государство.
So on the global arena, this country is considered to be to have a criminal community of people that are living here.
То есть оно европейское, но не совсем благополучное.
So it's it's a European country, but it's not that well off, not that civilized. That is how it is considered.
Ну вот как бы произошли события последних месяцев.
However, after several months, I mean, as we know, certain events took place in every country, actually.
И теперь весь мир стал неблагополучным.
And it turns out that whole world is quite unfortunate, in an unfortunate state.
Ну, в связи с разразившейся вот этой вот некой пандемией.
Due to the pandemic.
Да. И, безусловно, как бы, по сути своей, Украина живет своей привычной жизнью, неблагополучной.
And certainly, Ukraine keeps living its life, which is considered to be not to be well off.
А весь мир живет непривычной, неблагополучной жизнью, да, то есть.
And the rest of the world starts living that unfortunate life that they're not used to.
То есть, по сути своей, когда мы говорим о том, что произошло в последние 6 месяцев, это, ну, почему-то совсем как бы не удивляет международное сообщество.
When we speak about, when we look at the tendency of what has happened in the course of last 6 months, it is not that surprising for some reason to the international community.
То есть, по сути своей, низкий уровень жизни и нищета всегда были неким генератором преступности.
In a nutshell, low quality level of life and poverty were always generator of crime.
То есть, по сути своей, как бы снижение уровня жизни в Европе и как бы попытки европейских государств компенсировать это за счет кредитов или каких-то выделений средств как бы своим гражданам, оно не может быть бесконечно.
So the fact that the quality of life was decreased in many European countries, which was attempted to be compensated by government giving the credit and other sums of money. But certainly we understand that this cannot be eternal. It cannot go on.
То есть падение уровня жизни всегда приводит к криминализации общества.
So So what I'm trying to convey is that when the quality of life decreases, it always brings like more waves of criminalization in the society.
То есть, по сути, сегодня безответственность европейских правительств
So irresponsibility of the governments in Europe,
нарушение законов и ограничение прав граждан
trespassing the law and interfering with the rights of its citizens,
интенсивно криминализирует общество.
intensifies the criminalization of the society.
И, в общем-то, я хочу попробовать привести пример из того государства, в котором я, в общем-то, живу, из Украины.
So I'll try to provide some practical examples that have happened in Ukraine.
То есть наше правительство решило тоже нарушать законы, повторяя за европейским сообществом.
So the government in Ukraine, by attempting to imitate European governments, also started violating human rights.
Да, очень многие люди могут спросить меня, почему я так считаю, что они нарушают законы, вводя карантин. Ну, потому что в Украине уже существует постановление Конституционного суда Украины по этому поводу, что все действия правительства незаконны.
And so some people might wonder, why do I consider that introducing strict quarantine measures is the violation of human rights? And the answer, one of the obvious answers, is because Constitutional Court of Ukraine already declared this state of affairs of quarantining to be illegal.
То есть я не делаю беспочвенных заявлений.
Basically, this is not a statement that has no evidence. It does.
Да, но я помню, как это все начиналось, пока это не стало незаконным.
And I remember how all things were just in the stage of outbreak before it became illegal.
Да. И, в общем-то, через какой-то промежуток времени мы получили достаточно серьезную серию преступлений в Украине.
So after a while, after those events took place, we ended up having a series of criminal acts that were taking place in all places around the Ukraine.
Да, то есть, как бы, по сути своей, возникли преступления, которые, в общем-то, давно не случались в Украине.
So what has happened is that there were certain crimes taking place in Ukraine that we haven't seen in ages.
Ну, то есть у нас в полицейских с автоматов давно не стреляли.
I mean, it's been a while when we saw that people were shooting policemen from rifles outside.
Да, то есть, ну, тут даже такие случаи, так сказать, произошли.
But we ended up having cases as such.
И когда, как вы понимаете, когда государство нарушает законы, то общество считает, что раз государство нарушает законы публично, то почему бы и обществу тоже не нарушать эти законы?
Certainly, if governments, they regularly trespass the law, then society looks at it and says, and thinks at least that if the government is acting in that way, why don't we also allow ourselves to trespass the law?
И, безусловно, государство, которое не способно взять на себя ответственность в настоящий момент времени,
Countries that are incapable of taking responsibility now,
первое, что оно начало делать, это дискредитировать полицию.
the first thing it would be doing, it is doing, is it discredits the police forces
В глазах собственных граждан.
in the eyes of their own citizens.
И, в общем-то, я вам сейчас покажу, как европейские государства это делали и как это делали в Украине.
So I would like to share some examples how European governments did that and how it has happened in Ukraine as well.
Выглядит это приблизительно так.
So approximately it looks as follows.
Мы придумываем карантин,
We make up quarantine,
а полиция должна что-то с этим сделать.
and police has to deal with it in some way.
Но, в общем-то, все на усмотрение полиции.
So we will leave it to the police to decide whatever they will
И
do.
мы, как бы, в общем-то, если полиция что-то неправильно сделает, мы, в общем-то, тут ни при чем.
And in case police does something wrong and things go really wrong, then government would be, it would not take responsibility for that, basically.
И сразу же я увидел первый конфликт в Европе, это в Баварии было.
So the first conflict that I saw with my own eyes was in Munich, Bavaria.
Если вы не знаете, то баварцы к своей патрульной полиции относятся очень трепетно, они ее любят.
And as you know, residents of Bavaria, they are very careful about their patrol police. I mean, they really like it and respect it.
Начальник патрульной полиции Мюнхена сказал, что он ничего с этим сделать не может.
And when people were rioting, the head of the Bavarian police department, he said that, well, sorry, but we cannot do anything.
Один из самых громких скандалов в Германии.
And that ended up being one of the loudest scandals in Germany.
Он сказал, что дело в том, что у меня в моих полномочиях в законе нет карантина. Нет карантина, я не могу ничего делать.
And the head of the police in Bavaria, he said that in the constitution, in the law, there's nothing that says things about quarantine. That's why I cannot do anything.
Да, то есть по сути своей, когда это было на Украине и в том городе, где я живу, первому человеку одели наручники за то, что он не одел маску, то приехала половина адвокатов города на место происшествия.
When conflicts started arising in Ukraine, for instance, in the city where I reside, in Odessa, when a person was handcuffed because he didn't wear a mask, at that moment, there were so many attorneys that gathered on that event to protesting why would you handcuff a person for not wearing a mask.
И полицейские сильно пострадали.
And policemen were disadvantaged in that situation.
В правовом поле, юридически.
I mean, jurisdictionally they were not advantageous.
Да, то есть Украина хоть и не правовое государство,
even though Ukraine is not known for abiding the law.
Но мне сложно представить, чтобы в Америке полицейский пострадал за то, что сделал кому-то замечание или попытался одеть наручники за то, что кто-то не выполняет нормы карантина.
Nevertheless, it's quite hard for me to imagine a like situation in the US, for instance, when a policeman is disadvantaged just because he handcuffed a person who's not wearing a mask or any other situation.
И я хотел бы обратить ваше внимание на то, что в Австрии этих инцидентов было тоже не один.
And I would like to draw attention that in Austria, they also had several cases as such.
И хотел бы обратить внимание ваше на грамотную политику Хорватии в этом направлении.
And oppositely, I'd like to note a very well-planned politics in Croatia.
Я был недавно в научной командировке в Хорватию, в экспедиции. Я только приехал и смотрел на это все собственными глазами.
And the examples that I'm giving is because I saw them recently. Recently, I was in Croatia doing the expeditionary research, and I saw how things are well regulated there.
И, может быть, в Хорватии карантины существуют.
And I guess they do have some form of quarantine in Croatia.
Но я его не заметил.
However, I didn't feel it. It's not that pre-imposed in a way that makes you uncomfortable.
Полиция очень грамотно работает, и нет никаких проблем с гражданами.
And the way police behaves and acts is that it doesn't really create problems among citizens.
Единственный раз, когда я был в Сплите, мне один полицейский сказал: сэр, если будете в общественном месте, наверное, вам нужно одеть маску, потому что вы можете заболеть, вдруг заболеете. Это чистая рекомендация, не более того.
There was one situation when a policeman came up and said, here's just a recommendation if you're going to be visiting the city of Split, probably you should wear a mask in order not to get sick. But that was a recommendation, not something compulsory.
Окей. Вот. Как вы понимаете, психологическая напряженность, она никогда, в общем-то, ничем хорошим в государстве не заканчивалась.
Also, as history chronologically shows us that psychological pressure never ended well for any country.
И как вы понимаете, это прекрасная среда для развития преступности, потому что, в общем-то, если человека постоянно держать в психологическом напряжении, то рано или поздно произойдет срыв.
And psychological pressure is the perfect ground, in quotation marks, for new opportunities of criminality to take advantage of it, because whenever there is a high pressure, psychological type of pressure, at certain point there is an outbreak of it in some form.
Как вы понимаете, как бы мы говорим о самых обыкновенных гражданах. Это не люди, прошедшие какую-то специальную подготовку, имеющие особую выдержку, которые, извините, сутками могут стоять в одном положении. Да? Это самые обыкновенные граждане, которые населяют государства Европы, Америки там, и так далее.
And obviously, I'm speaking about the majority people, average people that do not have special training, that are not that capable, that enduring, people that are capable of standing in one place for a long time. No, we're just speaking about average, normal residents that reside everywhere.
Вот. И, безусловно, падение как бы, и экстремальная ситуация в экономике
So the extreme situation in economics
толкает бизнес на, скажем так, нетрадиционные решения.
It pushes, it forces businesses to come up with non-traditional solutions.
И по сути своей как бы это криминализирует экономику.
And that criminalizes economies of countries.
И, в общем-то, если мы обратим с вами как бы внимание на то, что, в общем-то, кто-то хочет и довести Германию экономически сегодня до состояния 30-х годов,
And if somebody wants to bring economy of Germany to the way it was in 30s,
а политика Ангелы Меркель это, в общем-то, то, что действительно сегодня разоряет средний класс Германии и делает Германию, ставит Германию на путь как бы потери и обеднения, да, то есть.
And meanwhile, considering that the politics of chancellor in Germany is very disadvantageous for middle class, the way she's leading the politics of the country is something which is not uniting country, but making it fall apart.
То, как и в 30-х годах, может появиться человек в Германии, в результате деятельности которого это все может закончиться всеевропейской или всемирной катастрофой.
And thus, considering the previous things stated about the Germany, it might be the case, not necessarily, but it's theoretically possible that they might end up having one person, just like it was in 30s, and it might end with a national or global catastrophe for all.
Если мы не хотим учить уроков истории,
if we people do not want to learn lessons from history,
то и для Европы, и для Америки все это может закончиться крайне печально.
Current situation might end really bad for the both Americas and Europe.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Dr. Maltsov. And I give the floor to Jerem Crace, please, dear professor.
Well, hi everybody. I'm glad got an invitation to join you. I haven't been called a criminologist for probably 40 years, and I regard it as a compliment that I could still be give that label. I'm reminded from Oleg's conversation there about a face mask. I was going to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter in the United States as being the difficult situation for police at all levels. But the mask example that Oleg gave is probably a better one because it seems so inconsequential, so unimportant in so many ways compared to police violence or something. But it brings up this issue that continues today, that police forces at all levels, but especially at the local level, are put in a situation where they are expected to solve social problems in particular that they're incapable of solving. In other words, they're being put into a position in society to try to deal with problems created by the society as a whole that they're really unable to do. It's not that they're unequipped to do it. They're incapable of doing it, because if the problems are economic problems, if the problems are political problems, if the problems are health problems, etc., the police are not to do that. And what I also thought I would do is to preface my remarks, because my work tends to be ethnographic and also autoethnographic. In other words, my own experience in politics and community organizations, not only locally, but nationally, internationally, give me a particular perspective. And my perspective, as I'm reminded occasionally when I read the current literature in any particular field, is that of a dinosaur in sociology. I was trained in sociology in the 1960s and 70s, and I'm still stuck almost like a broken record in that. And some of you here, I would assume all of you have heard of Merton's theory of anomie, which, despite the fact that it's diluvial, it's antediluvial also, still applies, right? And that's the idea that the goals in our society, in most of our societies, particularly when it's in reference to wealth and attaining wealth, right, are dominant, particularly when we're talking about the kinds of crime that we seem to be concerned with today. And so when the goal, when the means to attaining wealth, when the means to attaining whatever the social values are in that society, and this again, it could relate to what Oleg was saying, is that each society has different, but a lot of similar goals depending upon their development. When those things are blocked or made difficult, people, individuals, as well as groups, figure out ways of getting around the problems, getting around the law to attain those goals. And that hasn't changed, right? That hasn't changed at all. And I would like to bring our attention to, and I'm sure that the other real experts on crime who are here will agree with me, that these innovations in activity in order to attain these goals have been greatly affected by technology. Almost all of the crime activities that I studied in the 1960s and 70s and have observed since have been affected by, mostly by technology. Everybody's still, in a sense, doing the same kind of crime, but technology has given them the possibility of doing it in different ways. So as a consequence of that, we have enormous problems today, and I'll try to mention at least a few of them. I was on a dissertation committee in the 1970s on banking for the FBI. It was an FBI agent who had gotten permission from the FBI to do a dissertation, and it was secret, and it was on money laundering, right? And I remember that dissertation. I don't have a copy of it. I wasn't given a copy. I was given a copy to read. Looking back at that, nothing has changed except the technology. We recently saw an announcement of about $1 trillion in money that has been laundered, for organized crime, for drug dealing, for political people, oligarchs, etc. And the change has simply been technology, right? I remember also, being looking at frauds and scams back in the 70s and 80s that were picking on the elderly in the community, where people would knock on doors or send letters to people and get them involved in frauds, right? So today, they don't need letters. They don't need to knock on doors. They're doing it through email. They're doing it through other kinds of social media. So these things, I think, are good examples of these changes, which are expressed locally. You know, I do a lot of work on, people say, I do a lot of work on Brooklyn. Brooklyn's almost 3 million people, extremely diverse. What occurs here is connected, because of globalization, to the world. One can sit in a single spot today because of technology, and in essence, watch the world go around through their computer screens, right? And so that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing. And I see a repeat of old crimes done differently. What I see in Brooklyn when I studied ethnicity and machine politics, again, in the 1970s, of course I continued it. We know, as experts on crime, that organized crime and higher scale, high level crime cannot take place without some complicity of the political system, and also some complicity of the law enforcement and the judicial system, right? That was true in the 1970s with the Knapp Commission in New York City on police, and then investigations and judges. It continues today. And the way that you know it continues today, because the organized crime and those kinds of activities continue today. Some of those actions take place, particularly in the minority community. People of color are the ones that suffer the most for this: Latinos, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, etc. With, for example, predatory lending schemes, which again take place through technology now, and they're easy to do for it. And I'll mention one more thing before I cut out and allow other more experts to discuss it. This is true at all levels of crime, from street crime, okay, where people are using social media to figure out where it is that they should go to break into a house, all right, from street crime all the way up to the highest levels of crime, which take place in the financial institutions, you know. So what we see in the minority communities, for example, most hit by unemployment, when these federal assistance loans went out, we discovered now that hundreds of billions of dollars were diverted, right, from the people who needed it. And that again has a technological issue, and that is that low-income people, immigrant people, people who don't understand English very well, are unable actually to use the technologies in order to protect themselves, right? So I would say that the issue that pervades all the way from top to bottom, from left to right, right now, I think is technology. Thank you.
Thank you, dear John Chris. And I give the floor to Emilio Viano, please, dear professor. Меня не слышно сейчас?
It's on mute.
Dear Emilio Viano, please, you can continue. No?
It's on mute.
I'll try once more.
Ask him to unmute himself.
Yeah, I have it.
Yeah, please.
Just a moment. I was saying that I'm very pleased and honored to be invited to join this prestigious panel to talk about the impact of coronavirus on criminality and the responses that society might want to take against it. Certain facets of society's responses to the pandemic have increased actually many people's vulnerability to victimization. For example, the mandatory or optional shelter in place, that is stay-at-home command, and social distancing policies have actually increased people's dependence on the internet and the social media to communicate, keep in touch, order food, pay bills, share with others, contact the government, be in touch with the outside world. This has led to a large increase in various white-collar crimes, such as fraud, including false cures and useless masks and protective equipment, phishing emails, malicious web pages, online loan sharking going up as COVID-related unemployment and global economic downturn leaves many in debt, impoverished. Also, telephone impersonations of government officials, especially those related to pensions, Social Security, and medical benefits, and emergency disaster assistance program. Also, false donation appeals and other scams, as well as the accumulation of supplies and price speculation. With more people at home and bored without access to the outside world, someone says that access to street prostitution being severely curtailed, service website that feature trafficked or enslaved women may see a rise in online trafficking, perhaps stimulating efforts to entrap more women. So there are many different aspects of our lives that have been impacted by the shelter-in-place policies. Also, there has been a considerable activity of the darknet markets, including medical supplies, hiking of prices, counterfeit medical cures, and also the hospitals and medical establishment and pharmaceutical establishments have to be careful not to become subject to hacking and ransom demands. Among all of these possibilities, I want to cover just briefly a couple of them more in detail. For example, the illegal drug market. So there's been a general paralysis of the entire transport system, a drastic reduction of air, water, automobile, truck traffic. And this make moving vehicles more conspicuous, more visible, attracting more attention and inspection. Also, the emptying of the streets and public places of the big and even small cities made the sale of drugs, especially at retail, more difficult for, first of all, lack of buyers, but also more notorious and provoking a police response. To get around these obstacles, there is an increase in the use of drones, submarines, and manned platforms to deliver drugs, both wholesale and retail. The use of drones to smuggle drugs into prisons and across borders, to steal drug cargo from rivals, to monitor the terrain for rivals and the police has also increased. The disruption of this multi-million-dollar market has in turn created a series of cascading problems and challenges for the sector, most of them logistical and financial in nature, especially in the payment, of course, of debts and in the functioning of its economy and rewards system. So due to the lack of sales, cash has become scarce to pay for drugs received, to keep the system running smoothly, etc., etc. Additionally, drug trafficking organizations are facing shortage of precursors, the precursor agents for the production, for example, of fentanyl, as traffic from China and India, which normally provides the supply, has been disrupted. To solve this, various changes are taking place, some rapidly, some more slowly. In the short term, synthetic opioid production and its sale via the mail is likely to increase, with more devastating consequences as to deaths by overdosing or poisoning. This disruption also opened up the possibility for ambitious drug traffickers to invade and take over others' markets and supply chains, leading to an increase in gunfighting and killings. Another area, very quickly, is that of violent crimes and civil disobedience. Violent crimes, especially in cities already shaken by gun violence and drugs, continue to rise, regardless of the pandemic or not. The stay-at-home order has done little to prevent violence in some large cities. These incidents mainly involve disputes between rival gang factions and clashes related to the sale of illegal drugs. There is also the increase of domestic violence that was expected and is already documented. Although not new, some crimes are becoming more frequent and are often associated with the coronavirus impact on various activities and services, and with the dress rules like wearing a mask and behavior, staying at home, required or recommended to avoid infection. Civil disobedience against government rules and restriction is not uncommon. And this disobedience has also led to violence at times against staff in stores, restaurants, other businesses who demand that customers wear a mask or keep their distance from others. There have also been many incidents in the US when people asked to wear a mask verbally and physically attacked the employee who made that request. Thus, the coronavirus pandemic has in a way raised the potential for violence in unexpected areas against nurses, doctors, hospitals, restaurant personnel, and other service-oriented businesses. The third area I want to cover also quite briefly is other crimes. We talked about the impact on the drug market. We talked about the violence that some of the measures taken by the government cause in the community, in line in part with what our Ukrainian colleague mentioned. And now I would like to talk about other crimes very briefly. For example, the theft of packages delivered to a buyer at his or her residence. At times they are left at the front door or outside. And there are people that specialize now in stealing these packages. This has increased considerably. The opportunity, of course, has been created by a massive increase in requests for the delivery of a large number of items by people fearful of contagion if they go outside. So if they venture out to stores, such as groceries, etc. So they order their groceries, their prepared food, drinks, cosmetics, disinfectants, many other items for daily life to be delivered to their home. These thefts are a classic crime scene perpetrated according to what we call in criminology the routine activity theory. There is also traffic violations that are increasing, interestingly, particularly for speeding. And why is this so? Because there is much less traffic, or there was much less traffic because of the stay-at-home policy. Thus, the traffic is light, and some drivers take it as an invitation to go at a high speed in the city. We already talked about the increase in the abuse of illegal and illegal drugs, especially opioids, because it may due to boredom and the lack of other stimuli during quarantine. The assault on medical workers and police, as mentioned by our Ukrainian colleague, are also reported, usually by coughing, spitting, or sneezing. Hate crimes have also increased, especially against people of Asian descent, based on blaming China for allegedly failing to promptly alert the world to the coronavirus epidemic. There has also been an increase in vehicle theft. It's likely due to the suspension or reduction of public transportation, since many people need public transit to go to work, and they are often workers that have to go to work. They are declared essential workers. They often work in the lower paying employment, like cleaning crews, like restaurant workers, like people that maintain, let's say, the water system and electricity system and other necessities of life working. And often they don't have the money to have a car. At the same time, there is more public transportation. And public transportation is often the only means that they have to get to and from work. And so they may decide to steal a car in order to be able to go to work. So I try to cover very briefly the impact of coronavirus and also of the policies that have been adopted by the governments to counteract it, or at least to control the spread of it. And we covered in particular, as I said, the illegal drug market. And then we talked about violent crimes and civil disobedience. And then we talked about other crimes that are somewhat esoteric, like the theft of packages that also happens a lot during Christmas time, and the traffic violation, the increase in the use and abuse of illegal drugs, and the assault of medical workers and police, and the increase in vehicle theft. There are, of course, many other areas where there's been a change in the criminality and in the response of people to this crisis, but we don't have the time to go there. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Professor Viano, and of course, dear Professor, if you have the report, not in brief form, yeah, but the whole report, maybe some analytical, some statistics, you can send these materials to Communicate or our organized committee, and you can share with your colleagues. And of course, we will publish on the website, and we will share with your colleagues with these materials. So now I give the floor to Jeffrey Danick, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me here. It's a very prestigious organization, and listening to some of my colleagues on the roundtable, I'm very impressed with their backgrounds and certainly the comments up until this time. I think my first comment is, because this is kind of a COVID-centric discussion and how that affects us, I think that the development of these international relationships is a critical thing for law enforcement. And certainly this kind of a roundtable helps with that to a great extent. I spent a number of years with the FBI deployed overseas. And I would say that some of the most beneficial work that the FBI engages in centers around their liaison with foreign governments and foreign law enforcement agencies. So this is a very, very important piece of the law enforcement structure for both the US and foreign countries. And the ability to break down the border through relationships is one of the best tools we have in law enforcement. And anytime that we can have these types of international roundtables or symposiums, it seems to help and be steps in the right direction. The other thing is very important in my 30 years is to get a full community input. So that means I spent most of my time on the street. I was a supervisor and had many administrative responsibilities, but being on the street, you have to, first thing you have to do is take ownership of, you have a limited optic. So your optic is operational. And it's very important not to develop policies and procedures that are just based on operational input, that it requires a full listening to the entire community that includes academic, statistician, non-government agencies that have their hand on the pulse of the social structure, and that together these things are what solves our needs operationally, and where the police officer boots are on the ground, and where it affects directly a lot of the issues that I've heard brought up so far. On to the question, the first question. Interestingly, in the past week or so, we've had two pretty significant respected reports released on the tendency of crime in the US during the first 6 months of 2020. So first of all, we have the FBI's interim report on their uniform crime reporting statistics out. And we also have one of our top think tanks having released their report, which also was more concentrated on effects of COVID on 17 larger cities in the United States. So both of these reports are very enlightening. I've been studying them since they came out last week. And I'm going to share the links, of course, with the organization, and you guys can repost them and so that they're available for everyone to review. But basically, very interesting, serious. Most crime has been on a great downward trend, according to both of these reports, in the US during the COVID period, except recently we've had some serious spikes in murders and aggravated assaults. Some of our most violent crimes have come up in the last month or so. June was a big push, the last month of the 6 months reporting period. So that's kind of the big picture from what's going on here in the United States. From my end, I work in the criminal defense world a lot now, and I try to follow most cases that are charged by the Department of Justice. In the pre-COVID world, that's quite a task to keep up with. In the COVID world, where grand juries aren't meeting and courts aren't having hearings in person till really January, this coming January is the first that they're even going to try it. It's not as intimidating, but I can tell you what hasn't slowed down: the onslaught in the cyber world. So that would be the first thing that I would say is a COVID-centric uptick in the United States. And I see it manifesting itself in two very specific areas. First of all, ransomware. We are into a new variant of ransomware, and it is evolved into something very devastating. And this is in the US, what the FBI and our Secret Service is dealing with, has to do with the extortion and the leaking of the data. So in a traditional ransomware attack, the computers of the organization are locked up in exchange for a payment. And if a company has proper backups and has practiced booting back up from zero to operational from their backups, they usually are pretty good. They have to do a forensic sweep of the computers to make sure there's no malware left behind, but they're usually pretty good. So the bad guys have evolved, and the cyber attackers have evolved their game and stepped it up quite a bit. And what they're doing now is we're seeing this a lot of victims experiencing this now. They're stealing the data, and then they're putting it on dark websites and leaking it out and extorting the company. So it doesn't really matter. You don't have to back your system. It's not really as much of a threat of backing your system up and getting your data back. It's as keeping the data from being leaked, and that's the extortion, and the demands are going up quite a bit. So that's the first big vector in cyber. The second big vector is, and we don't know the impact on this yet, is the attack on the endpoints. So meaning that the work at home environment that has sprung out of COVID, you have an organization that would have very few people working at home to hundreds and hundreds. There was just a report released, I think it was New York City, where their city staff went from 30,000 endpoints to 700,000 endpoints. That means that there's 700,000 points of potential entry for cyber attackers to get into systems. And with the concept of dwell time, meaning that bad actors get into your system and lay there for a while, collecting intel on you and harvesting credentials and understanding the relationships of people in the company, that's why I say we don't know. The dwell time could still be pretty significant because the endpoints, we don't really know who has been hacked yet. They're still in the system. So those are the big pieces. I will mention in closing my comments to the first question is that the FBI has been busy, and to the extent they brought cases, there's a lot of COVID-related fraud. So the United States government had trillions of dollars in programs available to businesses. And I call it, there's been both an organized and a disorganized theft of that money. So it runs the gamut from a very highly organized and methodical attempt to steal money from the COVID funds to wholesale manufacturing. We pretend we set up a company, we manufacture employees, and we apply like we really were a business to get funds for reimbursement. So now we are seeing arrests during the COVID period by the FBI on that. So I think that's basically as an overview, my summary of the first question.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Eduardo Almeida, please.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. It is a privilege to join this distinguished group of experts and talk my perspectives about the cybercrimes as well and how crime is evolving in this COVID area. I intend to somehow expand a little bit this brilliant presentation that Jeffrey and Viano and Mr. Jerome and Oleg shared with us here. When we talk about COVID, we cannot, simply position crimes as stable and inflexible pattern. We've been seeing a lot of change in the recent month since COVID came up in the way crime is evolving. Crime is very fluid. The region where I am in now, Latin America, and I'm quite sure you all are familiar with the type of crimes that we see here, right? So you just turn on Netflix and you see, the drug cartels, trailers and series and things like this. They are still there, right? So the cartels, the 4 cartels in Mexico, very powerful way, they're still there. When we talk about the 2 cartels in Colombia, they're there, and many others. Violence is still present in cities like Rio de Janeiro, close to my hometown here. But when we come up with this new reality of COVID, we see that there is a kind of accommodation of certain types of crimes. So you see that it's unlikely that the shoplifting type of crime is increasing, right? So the crime is adapting. So now we are seeing more from the technology side. We are seeing a huge increase of digital threats and digital crimes happening, just like Mr. Jeffrey just mentioned to us here. So there are more sophistication around the typical digital threat. So we use it to see phishing and ransomware as a common pattern. A recent report from Interpol related that we have had more than 1 million, almost 1 million spam messages, new types of spam messages being sent to users during the first quarter of 2020, and more than 50,000 malicious URL being shared. So sophistication is arriving to the point that misinformation or fake news are becoming common in the society. So the crime is evolving to the point that informations are being hacked, people are being hacked, information is being stolen, and with the digital coin or crypto coins arriving, it's easier for threats for criminals to gather money from their criminal acts. The society has not yet, in many places, come up with a solution, with a perspective to solve this. So there are many places where you still don't have a kind of a global data protection regulation act. So the society is not there yet. Politicians have to evolve the discussions, and companies, governments, and civilians have to be prepared for this new digital era. We have much more sophistication now in terms of devices connected to the internet. So you have the Internet of Things advent, you have digital smart cities, and you have a lot of devices being absolutely connected to this new world. Being vulnerable means that somehow cyber delinquents and cyber criminals will take advantage of it, and they will steal not only money, they will ask not only money, but they will violate intellectual property that was part of this object stolen. In other words, this COVID pushed every citizen to home. So we have heard Alec here mentioning, the isolation that we have all gone through. So staying home and being connected more than ever. Not only ourselves. So the kids, they are having, distance learning. They are more connected than ever. They are vulnerable to content. The devices are more connected, and most of the case, people are not aware that some links might not be clicked. Some information should not be made available, and somehow, citizens are not prepared to this new pattern, to this new world, to this new connected world based on the demands of COVID. So the society has to evolve to the point that we have to have somehow education about cyber threats. Not much sophisticated information, but people have to be aware that whenever you click on a link, something will happen. Malicious software might be installed in our computer. Information might be stolen. You might have your privacy, violated, your personal and intellectual property stolen. And there is not a big campaign nowadays. We have been hearing a lot about misinformation, to the point that in my own perception, I believe that misinformation and fake news will start to be a common discussion with lawmakers. Countries will have to have a look at that and understand how much will be possible to allow people to spread misinformation globally or locally. And a consequence of it is that the borders are not sufficient to refrain criminals from acting, right? So every digital crime here and every kind of misinformation or fake news are not, simply confined in a geography. Someone can threat my security from anywhere in the world, even though I'm here in Latin America and most of you are in Europe. So the point that we have to make sure that is being observed now by policymakers is that digital crimes, they are not confined, they don't obey borders, and they are not easy to fight. As I mentioned in the beginning, crimes are very fluid. So we have to understand how can we be more effective fighting crimes in this new digital era. Most likely, digital crimes will become, in terms of not only volume, but also in frequency, the most common type of crime that we will see as society becomes more digital, more connected, and more integrated. This is my perspective, Konstantin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Salvatore Amato, please.
Hello. I also want to thank the organizers and Kenneke for the invite to participate in this very important roundtable. It's been very interesting so far. I'm going to depart a little bit from the prior speakers in that I'm going to talk about a very specific crime type. And I'm going to focus on wildlife crime and wildlife trafficking and the trends we are seeing largely, of course, due to the pandemic, and then some potential opportunities that these impacts may represent to law enforcement. I think this is particularly relevant to the discussion here because I think it's widely recognized that the COVID virus originated from wild animals, and that there's a clear link between the consumption of wildlife and the current pandemic. As a matter of fact, a result of that has been quite a lot of attention given to wildlife crime because of this link between this incredible impact that we are feeling globally and this clear link to consumption of wild animals and wildlife products. That attention has been both, it has its advantages and it certainly has its disadvantages. One of the early results of that attention was widespread bans of the commercial trade in wildlife and shutting down of wildlife markets. And you hear stuff like, we need to shut down and ban illegal wildlife markets and illegal wildlife trade. How do you ban something that's already by its very nature illegal and illicit? So there's a whole misunderstanding around these sort of knee-jerk reactions to banning wildlife trade and banning wildlife markets, although obviously they need to be further regulated and more attention needs to be placed by law enforcement in these areas. Wildlife trade is this huge industry. It's been labeled to have a value in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I read some reports here just in preparation for this, where a very conservative value for the illegal wildlife trade has it's in the $23 billion range, and others, and very frequently gets attributed to the hundreds of billions of dollars. I bring this up because it's the dynamic that drives this trade. It's a very highly profitable trade, and unfortunately it remains a very low risk trade. I'd like to just bring to your attention a seizure that happened within the last couple of days of a ton of pangolin scales in Hong Kong to show that even in the midst of this pandemic, wildlife trade is going on almost uninterrupted. That ton of pangolin scales was valued at having a value of over 6 million Hong Kong dollars. It was shipped from Indonesia. It was headed to mainland China and interdicted obviously in Hong Kong. And one of the things that I hope to get back to when we begin to talk about the second question here is, unfortunately, in wildlife crime and wildlife trafficking scenarios, all too often, these seizures that you see are the end of the law enforcement response, where I'm sure everybody in this roundtable recognizes that these seizures should represent the beginning of the law enforcement response. But I would like to briefly talk about what have been very clear impacts and the current trends of wildlife trafficking post-COVID and post this pandemic. There's been some recent reports by both the UNODC and I'd like to recognize the Wildlife Justice Commission, who did some recent analysis of the trends of trafficking post-COVID. And what we're seeing is that the measures that have been put in place globally to address the pandemic, which has been all discussed in depth here in terms of border closures and travel restrictions and stay-at-home orders and quarantine, have impacted all of us, have impacted people, have impacted businesses, and inarguably they have also impacted illegal trafficking networks. What I'd like to just point out 4 ways that we have seen how this has impacted trafficking networks and how those impacts may be an opportunity for law enforcement to capitalize on. And the first way is, unsurprisingly, the border closures and travel restrictions have made it much more difficult
for wildlife traffickers to transport and move their products. That's resulted in two immediate outcomes that we've seen very clear indications of. One, it's resulted in stockpiling of wildlife. Wildlife cannot always, don't always have reliable means to get to their end destination, so it results in traffickers stockpiling these products in either source or transit countries. It also has resulted in a very clear shift from air shipments to maritime and container shipments, which are less impacted than air shipments due to these pandemic restrictions. Second, just the impact of the aviation industry has had an impact to these traffickers. I'm sure everybody here has stories about either trying to travel themselves or hearing their colleagues trying to travel, and the circuitous routes that they're sometimes required to take during this pandemic to get to their locations. Well, traffickers are experiencing the same difficulties. And how that in particular impacts a trafficker is a lot of them are dependent upon reliable flights going to certain places at certain times, because frankly, they have corrupt officials waiting at the other end to help facilitate some of this trade. And if those routes are no longer reliable, you're not guaranteed that you're going to get to a specific airport or city at a specific time, and it makes it much harder to facilitate these illegal activities. Travel restrictions in general have had an impact on markets. There are whole markets in Southeast Asia in particular that cater to tourists who are looking for wildlife products, and they're going to specific markets looking for those wildlife products. Obviously, they are feeling the same impacts as any other tourist-based industry, and they're feeling the impacts of not being able to market their wildlife products. Again, probably resulting in stockpiling of those products. And then lastly, I'd just like to point out that on the other end of the supply chain, at the protected area and at the source for these wildlife, this virus has also shown, presented an opportunity for poachers to take advantage of park closures, reduced patrols, or law enforcement that has been focused elsewhere to increase their activities in these otherwise protected areas. So we're seeing an increase in poaching. At the same time, we're seeing it being harder for trafficking networks to move the product. And then I would just like to end by saying that despite these impacts that these trafficking networks are clearly trying to navigate, there are very clear indications that they are poised and ready to absolutely resume business once they're able to do so. So although they have been sort of rocked back on their heels and are impacted by the same types of travel and border control restrictions that we all have, they're stockpiling and they're ready to resume business as soon as those restrictions are lifted.
Thank you very much. And before we continue, I want to explain one thing. As you see, one of the goals of such roundtables and the European Academy of Science of Ukraine is to get information from different parts of the world and to create conditions of open dialogue without politicians, without governments, just the direct conversation between experts and scientists from different parts of the world. So, dear colleagues, I repeat that you can share by your materials, maybe some your reports, some scientific notes, and we'll share with you, and we'll create the unique informational conditions to know what happened right now in different parts of this world. So we can continue, and the second question is, will the post-pandemic era require new methods of countermeasures? And I give the floor to Dr. Maltsev, please.
Большое спасибо, что дали слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
Ну, как бы для того, чтобы с чем-то бороться или что-то предотвращать, нужно понимать, что происходит.
So in the first place, in order to combat or counterattack something, you have to understand what is going on currently.
И так как сейчас крайне опасная криминологическая обстановка в мире,
And due to the reason that currently we have a very dangerous situation in the world from the viewpoint of criminology,
никто не обращает внимания на некие логические как бы последствия, которые возникнут в силу того, что эта ситуация активно развивается.
people do not pay attention to logical small hints of consequences that might happen, because the situation it is just like increasing and developing and readjusting to these new circumstances.
Вы должны понимать, что современные государства — это государства, которые не живут мыслями вперед, то есть они не прогнозируют будущее.
One thing that we all know, that current modern countries are the ones that do not prognose the future. They act, not having a very far-reaching viewpoint.
Вы спросите, как же так?
And people might ask, I mean, how come? Why is that so?
Кто-то может даже начать восклицать: мы же платим налоги.
And some people might even say, well, we pay our taxes. That should not be the case.
Но современные правительства, современные президенты не нуждаются в таких людях.
Nevertheless, modern states and today's current leaders of countries, they are not, they do not feel the necessity in people that can make prognosis.
Их гений
Because their geniusness
и так знает, что нужно дальше делать и что будет.
knows what to do and what will happen anyways.
Как вы понимаете, я иронизирую.
And certainly this is irony.
Да. То есть, как мы увидели, Европа не способна прогнозировать ничего.
As we have seen from the consequences that are there, Europe is not capable of prognosing things.
Да, большинство специалистов в области прогнозирования говорят о том, что современные Соединенные Штаты Америки тоже не нуждаются ни в каких погрозах, их президент знает лучше всех все.
And most of the specialists in prognosis fields, they say that US also, I mean, they do not feel the necessity to have such kind of specialists, because the president, he knows what to do himself.
Но для того, чтобы понять, что происходит и что будет, в общем-то, не нужно быть никаким гением.
However, if we look at the situation, in order to understand what is going on factually and what is going to happen, you don't have to be like Einstein.
У современных государств совершенно отсутствует какой-либо люфт, то есть запас прочности.
So modern states, what they do not have is a certain threshold of security, something that might back up them in critical situation.
То есть, смотрите, мощности стран, их полиции настроены на определенную волну общества. То есть вот в Германии, например, там, в Австрии, во Франции существует определенное количество полицейских, они занимаются определенными, ну, как бы вещами. Вот это кажется достаточным, да?
And so usually the power component of the state is focused on one thing. It might be, for instance, society, it's their own citizens. Let's say, for instance, in Germany and Austria, their police forces, they have certain fields that are priority for them. So they focus only on that.
Обратите внимание, я не говорю про терроризм.
And please pay attention, I'm not speaking about terrorism right now.
Даже если бы мне предложили обсуждать эту тему, я бы ее не стал, потому что за все время существования Европы они не предотвратили ни одного теракта.
And even if there would be such an opportunity to speak about terrorism, I would have refused to do that, because in the course of so many years, we haven't seen even one case in Europe when they were capable of attacking terrorism, or, I mean, to preventing the terrorist attack.
В центре Мюнхена убили 15 детей в Макдональдсе с пистолета, как бы, и, в общем-то, правоохранительные органы до сих пор смотрят на это как на какое-то чрезвычайное происшествие. Они как бы никогда не могли бы подумать, чтобы в Мюнхене такое могло произойти.
For instance, in Munich, they were not capable of preventing the case when 15 people at McDonald's were shot. And afterwards, the law enforcement agencies in Germany, they were treating as if it was a real life emergency, as if they have never even dreamed that something like that could have happened.
Любой бы профессионал, который как бы, разбирается в этом вопросе, он бы просто улыбнулся.
And any professional that understands things like that, he would just smile at the situation.
Да. Невозможно бороться с терроризмом проверкой документов.
For the reason it is impossible to prevent and fight terrorism by controlling and examining documents.
Я не буду развивать эту тему, мы говорим о криминале.
However, I will not go deep into the topic since we are speaking about crime.
Криминале национальном и транснациональном.
And the criminality on the national and transnational levels.
Да, и хоть терроризм это тоже уголовное как бы преступление, но это особый вид, как бы уголовного преступления, поэтому про это мы говорить не будем.
Even though terrorism is also a criminal activity, but it follows into a special category, so I would not cover that.
То есть, если ситуация будет развиваться дальше точно таким же способом, то полиция начнет, как бы не успевать раскрывать преступления, которые как бы вокруг происходят.
In case things are going to be progressing in the way they are, then we will face a situation when police forces, they would just not be on time to investigate the cases because there would be just so many.
И, как вы понимаете, умные, так сказать, президенты, гениальные, они не найдут ничего лучшего, как ввести армию на улице.
And certainly genius leaders of the state, they will come up with a great idea, which would be introducing an army into the streets.
То есть они как бы дискредитировали полицию, теперь переложат всю ответственность на армию.
So once they would say, police is not capable of dealing with these things, okay, now we will put this responsibility to an army then.
Но так как армия совершенно не умеет ничего делать в городе, как бы кроме как воевать.
But since it is not the specialization of army to operate inside of the city,
это может закончиться печально все.
It might have very unfortunate consequences.
Итак, первая волна – это как бы полиция не готова к работе в тем условиям, в которых она сегодня работает, и не готова к тому валу преступности, как бы, который их ждет в ближайшее время.
So first wave that is observed that globally, most police forces are not capable of dealing with the situations that are happening right now. Plus, they will not be able to deal with such amounts of crimes if things are going to progress in the same sequence.
И в очень многих государствах, где правительство в своем уме,
and in most countries that have decent strategies and ways to deal with things,
они просто не стали создавать этой ситуации.
They prevented that. They didn't allow the situation to escalate to the level when it's like really emergency type of pandemic in the country.
То есть Нидерланды,
for instance, Netherlands,
Швеция,
Swiss,
Хорватия,
Croatia,
Португалия,
Portugal,
и так далее.
And other countries were much better than others.
То есть эти страны крайне грамотно работают как бы в условиях, которые как бы сегодня как бы существуют.
Those countries are quite efficient to operate and keep on their activities in the circumstances that we are now.
То есть они исключили саму ситуацию. У них карантин какой-то, если и существует, то в некой light форме, которая никого не напрягает.
So they have basically almost eliminated the situation in the form that they have quarantines, but they are in a different form that do not really escalate any types of problems in the communities.
Да, и самый лучший, конечно, карантин это на Украине.
And certainly the best quarantine is in Ukraine.
Да. Так вот, как бы, когда мы говорим о том, что это первая волна, вторая волна, это волна перестройки общества на другую систему работы.
And second wave is restructuring the way societies work to a new mode of carrying on their activities.
То есть, как говорит мой коллега и друг, как бы Джейми, как бы люди хотят жить лучше.
As my colleague Jerome Crace noted in the first sentences of his speech, is that people, I mean, every society, they try to make more money and simply to live better.
То есть, если мне негде работать, то я буду искать себе какую-то деятельность, которая будет обеспечивать меня и мою семью.
Certainly, logically speaking, if one has no place to work, he is without job, he would be searching for different ways to make money to provide for him and his family.
Может, в Италии будет семья, а потом я, а где-то будет я, а потом семья, но смысл от этого не меняется.
Maybe in places like Italy, the family would be on the first place and then me. In some places, maybe it would be me and then family, but the situation in the core is the same everywhere.
То есть надо как-то выживать.
So it's about, I mean, people have to survive in a certain manner.
То есть, по сути своей, как бы, когда люди становятся, ну, как бы, невостребованной экономикой, это приводит к краху экономики.
So in cases when people are not needed by their economies, the consequence is that the economy itself collapses.
И когда мы говорим о том, что сегодня возможности позволяют, как говорится, не выходить из дома или не выходить из ресторана и, работая с компьютером, заниматься бизнесом в другой стране или в третьей стране, то в этой стране, где вот такие условия, скоро работать будет некому.
Meanwhile, we keep in mind certainly that in this digitalized world, we can continue our work from home or from restaurant, etc. However, not all communities are like that. Not all communities have those possibilities and not all jobs have that. So in places where they do not have that opportunity, people will be jobless and they will be searching for different needs.
То есть, как бы, как говорят, рыба ищет где глубже, а человек где лучше, да?
So there is a saying in Russian, I'll be translating that verbatim, fish, they search the deeper parts in the sea, and humans, they search the better places for living.
И вот мы пришли как бы как раз к той самой электронике, к тому электронному миру, к той киберпреступности, о которой мы как бы все здесь как бы говорим немало. То есть увеличение электронного, как вы понимаете, вот все люди как бы говорят, в чем проблема киберпреступности? Ну, подумаешь, украли с какой-то банковской карточки $10 $.
So coming to cybersecurity and digitalization and these things, we are all on this panel covering a lot. From one side, when we speak about cybersecurity, one may say, so what is the problem? Let's say somebody, figuratively speaking, stole $10 from somebody's card. So what's the matter?
И никто не понимает, что самая большая проблема киберпреступности в мире.
And people do not understand that the most important problem when it comes to cybersecurity globally,
это постановка под сомнение и под возможность существования банковской системы.
The main problem of cybercrime is that it shows the banking system globally to be vulnerable, and it basically sheds a shade on it. So people start having different thoughts regarding the security of banking system in general.
А экономика без банков – это криминальная экономика.
And remember that economy without banking system, that would be criminal economy.
То есть, по сути своей, пока это считается криминальной экономикой.
At least currently it is considered to be criminal economy.
Но когда банковская система исчезнет,
However, when banking system will disappear,
и она станет альтернативной,
and it will become an alternative to
и
something,
никто не будет знать, кто владелец этой банковской системы,
and if nobody will know who owns that banking system,
это тогда просто будет называться банковской системой, а не преступной банковской системой, потому что другой банковской системы просто нет.
in such a case, it is going to be titled as banking system and not as a criminal banking system. For a simple reason, there's no other banking system.
То, что сегодня происходит в Европе, называется простым очень словом.
And what is going on today in Europe can be turned in one simple word.
Это ограбление среднего класса.
It is called extortion and robbing middle class.
И ограбление среднего класса может привести к серьезной интеллектуализации криминала.
And robbery of middle class can lead to serious intellectualization of crime.
То есть люди, которые с хорошим образованием, которые были порядочными людьми, которые совершенно не собирались становиться никакими профессиональными преступниками, они в них превратятся.
And here's what I mean by that. People that are decently educated, people that know how to do things, that were not even planning to do anything criminal, might really turn into sophisticated criminals.
В конце концов, это все закончится приходом криминала к власти.
And inevitably that might lead to the fact that criminality will become on the top of the governmental power.
И серьезному изменению общественного и государственного строя.
Which will also consequently lead to serious drastic changes in the country and the structure of societies.
И в заключение мне хотелось бы два слова сказать о политике Германии и ее роли в Европе в организации вот этого вот всего происходящего.
And in conclusion, I would like to say a couple of words about Germany and its role in Europe and organization of what is happening now in Europe.
По сути, политика Германии во время пандемии, она прекратила существование Евросоюза де юре.
Basically, the politics that were chosen by Germany during pandemic, it stopped, the existence of Europe de jure.
И продолжает разваливать Евросоюз.
And it continues to bring to collapse the European Union itself.
То есть сегодня уже заявление Италии о том, что она думает, она нужен ей Евросоюз, вызывают серьезные вопросы, как бы политические, экономические и так далее и тому подобное.
What is happening today, the current even thoughts of Italy, whether it needs to be in European Union or not, even this fact, raises a lot of questions about the situation.
Последнее, что я видел, это когда я был в Хорватии, когда человек, который приехал из Хорватии, должен был проходить тест на ковид в Германии.
The last thing that I saw that when a person came from Croatia to Germany, he had to take the coronavirus test.
Власти Хорватии возмутились.
And Croatian elected officials were anxious about that.
Они говорят, мы же Евросоюз.
They said, well, we are European Union, aren't we?
Что за дискриминация?
Why you are discriminating in this way?
А Германия говорит, а мы так решили.
And Germany said, well, this is our decision.
Прекрасно. Тогда Хорватия говорит, а мы тоже хотим подумать, а нужна ли нам Германия и нужен нам ли Евросоюз?
And in such a case, it's Croatia's turn to think, well, do we need Germany and do we need European Union?
Да, потому что огромное количество германского капитала сосредоточено в Хорватии.
Because a huge chunk of Germany's capital is concentrated in Croatia.
И достаточно Хорватии чуть поменять политику, и немецкому капиталу станет очень плохо на территории Хорватии.
And it's enough for Croatia to readjust a little bit its politics, and it's going to be really hard for Germany's capital in Croatia.
А я смог убедиться, что это такое государство, которое без инвестиций не останется никогда.
And there are so many evidences that I saw with my eyes as well, that Croatia is a country that will never be left without investments. I mean, it's
То
going
есть,
to be
по
always.
сути, сегодня политика Германии – это тот катализатор расширения криминала, который как бы является основным в Европе.
Basically, today in Europe, the politics of Germany at the moment is the main catalysator which widens the volume of criminalization in Europe.
То есть, по сути своей, как бы, это та политика, которая создает условия для криминализации Европы.
So, in other words, that politics, it creates conditions for criminalization in Europe.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, dear Dr. Maltzer, for your prognosis and predictive model. And I give the floor to Jerome Crace, please.
Okay, I'm going to be brief because you guys have been covering so many good things. But as far as sharing stuff, I've been doing some ethnographic and visual ethnography and multimedia ethnography and digital ethnography during this particular period. So I'll be happy to share some of that information as it pertains to crime, both photographing, for example, the leaving packages, etc., and stuff that I've gotten from Facebook and listservs and community organizations that have been talking about crime. I also want to say, I think Emilio and I are old friends, but I don't know whether he remembers from 40 years ago, but we'll correspond at some point. The other thing that I want to mention is in terms of these problems of masking and COVID, I mentioned police, and several of you have done the same thing. In New York City, there's a major problem with the Hasidic Jewish community, with them not observing the masks, etc. And there's actually was an article today in one of the papers about the possibility, just imagine this, in terms of causing problems and international issues, of restricting mobility of people living in their communities, which are essentially voluntary ghettos. And just think about what kind of a problem that could cause. Just the idea of thinking about that brings up some tremendously difficult issues in terms of both public health and also of religious freedom and bias. The one thing I want to mention specifically about having to deal with in this post-COVID environment about cybercrime is most of you will probably emphasize the training and software and hardware, etc., for enforcement agencies or for judicial agencies or for government agencies. I think the first thing that we have to do is actually train and educate ordinary people who are using the social media systems, etc., on not only what the problems are, but how to deal with them and what not to do. And this should start not simply with the young who know how to use the technology, but are not really aware of the dangers of that technology, but especially older people who are not familiar with that technology, who are very easy victimized by this, okay? And again, I could share you some of that too, because I'm in that age category, and the fact that everybody knows that I'm way over 60 years of age, the communications that I get online, email, social media, messaging, etc., which I know are scams. And I want to mention again, because I've gone back to the 60s and 70s, I was one of the first people that corresponded with the FBI and with the State Department when I began to, I and other people began to receive mail, if you remember the old days, from Nigeria, you know, which was one of the hotbeds for banking fraud in those particular days. So I would emphasize that, you know, it's the general population, okay, that has to be educated and trained about the dangers of the internet, and for them to be able to understand it and learn, for them to learn how to protect themselves, because otherwise we have enormous problems of privacy. You know, should this be a government thing? Should this be a private agency thing? How do we protect in a country like the United States, which is already worrying about losing its individual rights? Okay, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate here, and I think meet an old friend.
Thank you, dear Professor Crace, and we are happy, we are glad that thanks to this round table, we can communicate old friends and old colleagues, and to give opportunity to continue your dialogue and your conversation. And I give the floor to Emilio Viviano, please. No. One, please. One click. Your mic is off. One second, please, Emilio. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
I was just trying to give you time to speak. Thank you very much. I debated what to include in the countermeasures, and thinking of the time limits, it might be relatively short. And what I wanted to emphasize is the fact that the coronavirus is possibly emerging as a result of wildlife trafficking and the consumption of wild animal meat. So in a sense, COVID-19 is influencing crime and illicit economies around the world. Some of the immediate effects are likely to be passing. Many aspects of the way that we are living today, hopefully someday will be a distant memory, but others will need more time to appear even, and will also be longer lasting. There are, of course, positive and negative consequences. For example, we have all discovered finally in the world that we don't need to always get on airplanes to meet colleagues and to participate in a round table, that we can do it without having to travel, without having to spend a lot of time on an airplane. The virtual teaching, the virtual learning, and the virtual communicating. Anyway, I want to stress a little bit this wildlife route of the coronavirus. African and East Asian wildlife markets have long been known to be active transmission areas for killer pandemics. Wild-caught animals or animal parts, often poached or trafficked, are sold in crowded places with few or non-existent health controls. However, although wildlife consumption, poaching, and trafficking have been associated with SARS, Ebola, HIV, AIDS, and will produce new zoogenic diseases, policymakers have paid little attention to this, to wildlife trafficking. Also because it is connected to the idea of hunting, sports, income for the local population and the countries that have these animals, and so on and so forth. Presently, in response to COVID, China has banned the sale of wildlife meat, but it has not banned the trade in wild animals that can be had as pets, for example, significantly undermining any potential effectiveness of the ban. The government of Vietnam, another key poaching, trafficking, and wildlife consumption country, is exploring a possibly more comprehensive plan in wildlife trade, but no definite ruling has yet been issued. Unfortunately, however, neither ban may last, even if it were introduced. In both China and Vietnam, the sizable industry of wildlife trade is economically important and politically very powerful. China's pharmaceutical industry markets traditional Chinese medicine remedies. It has succeeded actually in getting its critics, including Chinese medical doctors, arrested because they denounced their unproven and often also disproven quack potions doing more harm than good, or at a minimum being totally ineffective. So if someone tries to advise the public that these cures don't cure anything, if they are in some of these countries, they can get in big legal trouble and even end up in prison. China similarly banned wildlife market after SARS. China even enforced the ban because it's one thing to declare it, another thing to enforce it, but only for a limited time. Within 3 years, the country's wildlife markets were not only back, but larger than before. It must be kept in mind that it is true, the poorest people in rural areas depend on wildlife consumption for basic subsistence, even as such consumption enables the emergence of zoogenic diseases. It is even part of the American folklore that those who settled the country, particularly traveling west, had to depend, of course, on wildlife for their source of protein, for their source of meat. It will take a major international effort for COVID-19 to lead to the adoption of robust and lasting measures to suppress poaching and wildlife trafficking to avoid another epidemic in the future. Moreover, the expected global recession that is going to accompany the coronavirus crisis may exacerbate pre-existing and growing rural crime and conflict, such as between farmers and herders, that is actually increasing across Africa, often with deadlier results than local militancy and terrorism. For example, the Fulani in Nigeria are an example of these clashes between herders and farmers, and the sources, of course, of their food and of their protein. Even in the USA, the Endangered Species Act is under constant threat by the current government, and the prohibition of the importation of wild animals hunted especially in Africa have been weakened or ignored and often given an exemption. This neglected illicit economy will probably unleash another pandemic on the globe, maybe a few or several years, a century maybe from now, but it will happen. An international consortium fighting wildlife crime is very much needed. In other illegal economies, such as the illegal drug trade, the COVID-19 disruptions will be even more short-lasting. After temporarily wreaking havoc with some types of crime and facilitating others, the coronavirus will leave behind the smartest and most adaptable criminal groups. It will be kind of a natural selection of the best among the criminal groups in a certain sense. What are other remedies to prevent the pandemic in the future? Well, we should also revisit the way in which we farm, in which we raise animals for food. We process them and we market them. Stressed animals become more easily sick and become vehicles for transmission of diseases. These animals quickly, to bring them to market in order to obtain maximum benefit financially, has also sped up the way in which they are processed. This has happened also here.
We have some problem with connection with Emilio Banio, and we'll wait.
I think can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were somewhat interrupted by that. Yeah. Anyway, the final point that I want to make is that there are many facets of this wildlife poaching, trafficking that are happening in our society, and the need for us to address it, and to address it, for example, in forming coalitions to fight it, in creating maybe an international court that addresses corruption that is rampant, particularly in customs and that allows the entry of this, possibly infected meat, and also the application more seriously of a treaty that has been approved not by too many countries called CITES, that has to do with the endangered species in our society, and also to train the police, the prosecutors, the customs officials, so that they can really intervene effectively because they have the knowledge, the understanding, and the know-how to stop this poaching and this illegal market. Also, we have to change a little bit our perception of the sport, supposedly, of hunting this type of animals that are then, of course, used in many places for human consumption, and also to educate people more on what is the proper diet that we should follow. Some people may say, well, you can never change that because it is part of culture, tradition, and what people have been doing for a long time. Well, think of what happened to cigarette smoking. Many years ago, it was everywhere, even on airplanes. Today, it is relatively rare in many countries of the world, and it is quite controlled, particularly when we are forced to be in an airplane, for example, for several hours. Well, this seemed impossible years ago because smoking was so common everywhere. So we can certainly change and educate people better on how to eat, on what to select for their food, and also in providing it in a manner that is affordable to them. So in response to COVID-19, I believe, even though it may appear distant from the immediate urgency of the needs today, that we talk about this wildlife management, this poaching and the illegal traffic, and that we condemn, of course, even the so-called sports killing that are approved in part and justified with saying by paying a fee to Botswana or to Namibia or to South Africa or whatever, we are contributing to their conservation efforts. What a nice illogical point, but that by killing an animal that we paid for, we are helping conserve that animal species. It doesn't seem to square very well with logic, but in any event, there is a lot to do for the long run and the long term, but it is essential because without intervening in this very expanded and profitable and wide market of illegal poaching and selling, another epidemic cannot be excluded, just as we had it with SARS, with HIV, AIDS, and now with COVID-19, and more are coming down the way. Last point, the environment has also to be protected, because very often today, with our going into areas where humans never went, think of the Amazon forest and the fact that through the burning of thousands of acres now, we go to where before we couldn't go. And that is true in every country, not only in Brazil in the Amazon forest. We are also opening ourselves to illnesses, to infirmities, to viruses that were not coming close to humans before, and to which we have no defense, and that can cause crises like this one, can really basically destroy an economy, at least for a time, and cause problems not only in one country, but everywhere in the world. So there is an environmental aspect to the COVID-19 remedies, and there is also this wildlife aspect, and the treaties and conventions like CITES that are supposed to address them, but that have been really not respected very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilio. And I want to say one thing. I know the position of Salvatore Amato that wildlife crime is a very specific field in criminology. But as you see during the round table, Emilio shows that you can find the common interests in such fields as wildlife crimes, and it's very interesting. That's why we decided to organize such roundtables. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, thank you, and I give the floor to Jeffrey Danik, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what's going to be new in a post-pandemic, or we hope to get to a post-pandemic environment? I think as an operational law enforcement officer, the first thing we have to do is increase our planning for our employees in law enforcement. So and what I mean by that is the planning for if we get another pandemic or something more serious than a pandemic, and I don't mean to downplay what has happened to the world here, but as far as types of attacks that could happen, it could be much more devastating. It could affect our direct responders, people in that age range heavier. It could be a much more transmittable type of a disease or incident that we're dealing with, and make it even that much harder for us to accomplish law enforcement purposes. So we need to use this as a wake-up call, I think, and really plan effectively as to what first responders are susceptible to infection, maybe, who can withstand it, who can be out in the field, who might serve a better role behind the scenes, and that type of thing. And of course, by extension, and we've seen it here repeatedly in the United States, their families. So it's not just the first responders and the police officers, it's their families who they live in close proximity with. Some of the police officers here that I know personally, they have very vulnerable children with medical conditions. They have older elderly people that they are dealing with at home. And so these conditions need to be taken into account in our response, because it would be exponentially worse if we had absolutely no police response, because everybody really did have to be separated and locked down. So that's the first thing I think that needs to be done. Next thing I think in the post-pandemic planning scenario needs to be our critical infrastructure. So that's our supply chains. And we see here in the United States, or really around the world, even something simple like ventilators, we didn't have the ability to come up quickly and manufacture these things. There was a learning curve to them. And we need capacity within each country, because it's difficult to get these machines and things that you might need in a future pandemic quickly. And that needs to be triaged and planned effectively. The logistical piece of it, the medical personnel piece as a supply chain to delivering, right? Because you can't deliver the results to the public without the medical professionals. So they need to be evaluated much in the same way that our police and first responders are evaluated as to who can do what and what are their vulnerabilities away from the job, because that will distract them. A big impact here in the US has been the effect of this pandemic. And so we really need to plan in the future about incarcerated persons. Those are the people that are already in prison here, and what should be the criteria for release, or maybe facilities that are more safe to hold them in. Also bail, people just arrested but not convicted, and how that plays out. We need a better policy on bail, and so that everybody understands it, and so that there's a better buy-in agreement through the public. And of course, the court hearings. So here federally, the federal government is not meeting, especially in my area in South Florida. There's no in-person meetings until January. So hearings are trying to be done by Zoom, and this is it's kind of a problem. I have a hearing coming up where we need to cross-examine in detail certain witnesses, and they're going to be on Zoom, and we feel that that's not, we would be better if we were in court with them. So the court hearings themselves need to come into focus. And I would say that maybe in closing, there might be one other beneficial thing. Right now, of course, the criminals around the world, terrorists, they play games with the borders. So they separate us and they make it difficult for me, right? My enforcement authority stopped at the US border. So if I needed something done and I was assigned in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the Horn of Africa, but even when I was forward based there and living in Riyadh and working in Kuwait, I couldn't do anything. I wasn't operational, and I needed the effective use of those foreign personnel to do work. And there was a process to requesting that. So possibly we would consider that the governments get together and say, the process is good, we like the process, we'll try to improve the process, but if we get hit with another pandemic, just like we've suspended many rules, perhaps temporarily we can suspend our cooperation rules. So it's much easier for me to request assistance from one country to another in specific criminal acts, to follow up on addresses, to look for certain individuals, to gain logs of computer networks, that type of thing. And to make that process faster in a pandemic, to make it easier, because it's difficult. I have to go through a process and none of those people are working. I have to go to a federal prosecutor, ask them for help. They have to go through the Washington office of the Department of Justice. And this is a process, and each step of the way is thwarted by working at home and encrypted documents and getting with the judge. So possibly there's a way to approve at least some of these things ahead of time and be able to declare in an emergency, and in certain maybe higher priority cases that these things can be expedited. That's basically the general response I have to the second question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so we can continue. And as you see, we gathered the experts from different parts of the world: USA, Latin America, United Kingdom, Italy, Germany, Ukraine, and please, we want to know what about the second question. Think the Latin America, and in the face of Eduardo Almeida, please.
My pleasure, Konstantin. So the countermeasures. So still talking a little bit about digital threats and how this whole world is becoming more complex with the cyber crimes. In my understanding, there are two things that must be, observed by local authorities. One is related to citizens, and I really, really like it what Mr. Jerome mentioned about educating the citizens and educating the society about what criminal threats are all about and how to prevent it. And the second one are the countermeasures that governments have to implement in order to make society safer. Okay, so talking about this particular topic, digital criminals, they target two things. So one is the financial benefits that Oleg mentioned very well, and the second one, I would say that it's even more important than the finance benefit, which is the data. So there are a lot of things around social engineering happening in the world now that not necessarily cyber terrorists will take benefit of it. Companies or individuals that are trying to get some benefits from particular private data from citizens that have to be observed as well. So government have to implement new regulations for data protection. This is happening in many places, but not all over the place. So new regulations are definitely very important to regulate this. new world, new digital world that we're living in. The second topic is around cooperation, and Jeffrey was talking about the global or the international aspects of crime. So governments and government entities, agencies, they have to collaborate more. They have to have agreements to prevent money laundering, to prevent anti-corruption or to prevent corruption from happening. And this is going to be more effective as much as governments are able to collaborate amongst themselves. And finally, the other point is what I was mentioning about new education with a digital mindset. So we have to educate people, and again, not only the youngers, like Mr. Jerome mentioned, the elderly people and the whole society who are connected somehow to understand what types of threat will be considered to take benefit of the ignorance that one may have, and definitely compromise data, particular data. So I'm going to be really brief about this. Those are probably the three major aspects of my intervention here. So protect citizens against cyber criminals and social engineering, and the government has to reveal its international policy for a better international cooperation, new regulation towards data protection laws. Thank you, Konstantin.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Salvatore Amato, please.
Thank you. I get to play wrap up here, I guess. And I will keep it brief. I have given thought to this question about whether new approaches and new methods will be needed post-pandemic. And I've largely come to the opinion that no, we don't need new approaches. We need to use the mechanisms that are available to us now and effectively have law enforcement act as a deterrent for illegal wildlife crime and wildlife trafficking. But what is happening currently and what will be the reality post-pandemic is law enforcement has an opportunity to sort of ride this crest, this wave of sentiment with regards to wildlife consumption and wildlife crime. And right now there is a stigma attached to the consumption of certain wildlife products, and that might translate to a reduced demand. And there is support and there is public recognition of the importance of addressing and stopping wildlife trafficking. So I think there's an opportunity for law enforcement to ride that and to strengthen their current efforts. And as my colleague, Mr. Danik said, key things will be international coordination. And just as simple as you can't address transnational crime if you're doing it within the silo of your own national borders. You just can't do it. So we have to improve international coordination. And hopefully this new support and new perception of the importance of this will translate to the use of, they're not new techniques, they're not new approaches, but financial crime techniques need to be applied to wildlife cases. Anti-money laundering techniques need to be applied to wildlife cases. And things that are commonplace in other types of trafficking, like narcotics, like controlled deliveries, are still frequently, if ever, applied to wildlife trafficking cases, and that needs to change. And there's an opportunity here to change that dynamic and frankly, just simply start to change the dynamic of a high value with low risk activity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's a good idea to give the opportunity maybe to each expert to summarize this conversation, maybe to share by your own impression. So, Jerome Crace, what do you think about this roundtable? In a few minutes.
Oh, what do I think about it? I was very, very happy to be invited and for me to remember my criminological mind. I actually started as a criminologist at Indiana University back in the 1960s with people like Carl Schulzler and Alfred Lindesmith. So it's great to bring that back, and for me actually to realize that as a sociologist, crime is always a part of the society that you study, no matter what you're doing as far as sociology is concerned. And also to hear people much more expert than I, especially on the issue of the cyber issues that I've seen in my work as being so important. So I'm very grateful to having been here, and glad to have learned from my new and old friends.
Thank you. Emilia Werner. Turn on, please, your microphone. Yes. We don't hear you for now, but we hope to hear you.
Okay.
No, your microphone is off.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now it should be working, right?
Okay, now.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about the little delay. I was looking at the file, and anyway, I was saying that I think it was an extremely useful meeting of the minds, different perspective, people coming from different places in the world and sharing their life experiences and their analysis and research. I think that there is a lot of work to do. The coronavirus has really put us in notice that our society, as sophisticated as it might look, as advanced, as technologically savvy as some people may describe it, as capable of dominating nature in many different ways, is still extremely vulnerable to nature itself. And that we are still at times defenseless against it. The only defense is to stay home and try not to go outside and be very careful with what we touch and to clean and wash our hands all the time. So that should give us some humility in our hubris of technologically advanced societies and countries that think that they don't need to pay any attention to what is happening around them. And for this reason, I repeat, the last comment that I made prior, that aside from all the other measures that we have to introduce, including, of course, a vaccine against coronavirus, we also have to stop and think, what are we doing to the world that is launching this type of epidemics? Because for all of us in this panel, maybe with the exception, of course, of Mr. Tursun Sabaeva, I think all of us at different ages, we have lived through HIV, AIDS, with the Ebola, with the SARS, and now with the coronavirus epidemic. So within our lifespan, we have gone through at least 4 major epidemics, not all of them of the same force, but all of them extremely lethal to where they hit, particularly continents like Africa, for example, with both HIV and Ebola. So why do we have these epidemics? Where do they come from? What is happening? Aside from the theory that the coronavirus and also HIV were created in a laboratory and by military, maybe, or China or Russia or the US or whatever, and escaped, I think that the more rational approach is to say that they come from nature, and that our stewardship in protecting the environment is not just good policy to look at green trees, but it is also to protect ourselves, protect our family, and protect our children, grandchildren, and future generations. We are going where we could never go before, in part because of having, for instance, drones that can help us scope out the territories. We are destroying forests everywhere in the world and penetrating areas that were not touched by humans until now. And it is no surprise that there are surprises there for us. And those surprises are relatively negative, damaging, and even paralyzing to the entire world. So, as I said before, cooperate in the enforcement of the international conventions related to climate change and to the protection of the endangered species, and institute maybe stronger mechanisms to fight corruption, particularly in international trade, at the customs posts, and in other places of government, and most of all, offer also better training to the police, to the customs officials, to market inspectors, to everybody that can come in contact with this situation. And most of all, treasure the earth and protect it, because in the end, we are going to be protected as well.
Thank you, Emilio. Salvatore Amato, please summarize maybe in a few minutes what do you think about this conversation?
It's been said, so I don't want to just cover old ground, but I was very happy to be part of this roundtable. I found it very interesting, and particularly to hear how there's more commonalities across these different perspectives, and there is uniqueness. I also, again, just to reiterate what I ended with, that I hope that there is a recognition that wildlife trafficking, which unfortunately has been for the decades that I've been involved, continually considered a low priority and not a very important crime type. And I hope that that changes, because as my esteemed colleague Emilio has pointed out, it very much impacts the very planet we're living on, and how we manage to coexist on this planet. And I hope that dynamic will start to change.
Thank you. Eduardo Almeida, please.
Thank you very much, Constantine. It was a privilege to be here and learning so much and exchanging this experience. I also appreciate very much, and I do believe that this event was very effective to discuss this new momentum with coronavirus. As I have mentioned previously, you know, a crime will also adapt and evolve depending on the circumstance of the society. We are having a situation nowadays that, you know, was very hard to imagine, right? People are staying home as needed, but crime will certainly move and find a space to penetrate and cross the walls and the doors and make bad things to society. So I just want to reinforce my appreciation and thank you very much for having me as well.
Thank you. Jeffrey Danick, please.
Yes, well, I thought it was a very productive meeting and good analysis of what's the readout from the pandemic, how were we affected, and we had a good conversation. I certainly learned some things about planning for the future and the way that law enforcement maybe should think about framing their structure going forward. So I certainly was impressed with the colleagues, and thank the organization for inviting me and having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, I give the floor to Dr. Maltsev, because I can say that Dr. Maltsev is the father of this roundtable. It's his idea, his concept. So please summarize.
Я буду очень коротко подводить итог.
Well, I would like to briefly summarize.
Я считаю, что все наши проблемы от двух вещей.
I think most of the problems that we have come from two things.
Это безответственное общество, в котором мы живем.
First is the irresponsible society that we live in.
И абсолютно никуда не годящееся руководство.
And incapable and not adequately trained leadership.
И нам нужно сейчас думать, не нам конкретно сидящим за этим столом, а всему мировому сообществу, как сделать так, чтобы ими не руководили неспособные люди.
And it's crucial for the international community to make sure that they are led by capable people, by competent ones.
и как повысить образованность, и компетентность и ответственность общества.
And the second thing that should be on the agenda, in my opinion, is to how raise awareness and competence of society in general.
И для меня большая честь находиться в вашем кругу, коллеги.
For me, it was an honor to be in this round table among my distinguished colleagues.
Спасибо огромное за участие в нашем уже ставшем традиционном круглом столе.
Thank you very much for participation in the round table, which already became even like traditional.
И я надеюсь, что эти круглые столы станут традицией для нас.
And I hope that these round tables are going to continue and become a steady tradition.
Потому что и для профессионала, и для ученого общение с коллегами – это самое важное.
Because both for professionals and scientists, the exchange, the effective exchange of things is very valuable and the most important thing.
И по сути своей, как бы мы именно в результате этих круглых столов обмениваемся мнениями.
And as a result, on this round tables, we are able to hear different perspectives from different parts of the world.
Что заставляет нас задуматься.
And that also makes us think and come up with other things.
И продолжить нашу с вами работу еще на более высоком уровне.
And it also pushes to think and continue our work on a different, better level.
Спасибо огромное.
Thank you very much.
So let me thank all the speakers, dear colleagues and experts. The first online roundtable on organized crime and criminal traditions is about to be over now. In the course of several weeks, the Scientific and Organizing Committee will prepare the resolution, which is going to be available on the website, and every speaker is going to be notified. The news on the media coverage of the given conference will be also notified by the Organizing Committee. So thank you all for your contribution and participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.